This is the third and last of the three sessions of the course, and I want to briefly go back to the first two in order to present the context. But before I do that, Esther made a question before. You can see it in the chat. Why is it? While it's quiet, I have a question. Several organizations are offering classes on Spanish, Latin Jews. Are any particular reason or just coincidence? And I was mentioning to Esther that it's indeed a fact. There's a growing interest in the Hispanic Jewish diaspora. It's a geopolitical change. I think that after a long period of eclipse, or maybe that's not the right word, of disinterest, there is a genuine desire to understand both Spain and the Americas in terms of their Jewish components, and a vast number of Jewish cultural organizations are expanding this banquet. I also feel, Esther, that we are witnessing a genuine growth of the scholarship connected with these parts of the world. There is much to learn from them and about them, and much to go. As you could see from the reading of Marshall Meyer, there is much to do in the effort to go beyond stereotypes. So I'm hoping that we will see a new generation of people, scholars that will draw light to all this. And another question from Karen, who asked, we know about the Jewish immigration to Latin America in the 20th century. When did the Jews or conversos reveal themselves? In the Southwest USA, it was about 3 decades ago. And what was the reason? Very briefly, because I want to go to my topic, but it is indeed a fact, Karen, and thank you for the question, that there has been coming out of the closet of the converso and crypto-Jewish families in the American Southwest, in northern Mexico, the states of Sonora, Sinaloa, Nuevo León, and also in different parts of Latin America, in Mexico, in Mexico City, in Peru, in Colombia, families that for a long time have kept their Jewish identity secret, or that didn't know anything about it, and now there has been an attempt to expand on this, and many of them have converted to Judaism, or at the very least have found a way to expand their own vision of what their family tradition and identity are all about. The crucial part of your question to me comes at the end. What is the reason? And very succinctly, we can talk about it in another context or in the Q&A if we have time. It seems to, that for a long time, being Jewish was seen as a stigma or a dangerous aspect that people wanted to care carefully through. And in the second part of the 20th century, beginning 2 decades of the 21st century, being Jewish became hip and hype. And there was power in it, there was cultural gravitas in it. And I think that prompted others who had kept their secret Jewish identity for long generations to start coming out. When does anybody come out? You can see it also in terms of gender or in terms of race, at moments where it's a democratic, open, freer landscape than in the past. That propels people to feel more comfortable acknowledging parts of themselves or of their family members that they didn't before. So that, in my view, is part of an explanation. Friends, my intent during these 3 sessions, during this course, has been to, in a very selective way, to choose 3 pivotal moments in the history of the Jews of Latin America to appreciate the theological challenges and the innovations and the emerging voices of these communities. And I started with the first session with the colonial period and the conversos, and I focused on one individual, Luis de Carvajal the Younger, who arrived from Spain to the Americas in the 16th century, brought by his uncle, and eventually decided that he was a kind of biblical prophet whose mission it was to spread the word, to evangelize or proselytize Judaism in colonial Mexico. A fascinating figure, bipolar likely or schizophrenic, who left us with an autobiography, a last will and testament, and also a series of letters. And in retrospect, after having gone through the first session and the second session, I would suggest to you that he is a kind of rabbi. And I know it's a contested term, a kind of rabbi that wants to lead his community, a fragile community, a community that lives in secret, that keeps itself away from the public eye, into recognizing its own past and feel freer and engaged in a way that wasn't possible in Spain. I say he's a rabbi because I want to use the term rabbi as I move into the topic of today, but not before I go to the second session, and that was about arguably one of the, if not the most important Argentine writer of the 20th century, Jorge Luis Borges, who became a major figure in Latin American literature and in world literature. We in Latin America say that the 20th century was the Borges century. And I stress that while Borges wasn't Jewish, he had a lasting and deep thirst to understand Jewishness in a variety of ways, and wrote poems, short stories, and essays that show Jews in a variety of contexts and have been instrumental to understand what Latin American Jewish life is all about. And in the context of theology, if Luis de Carvajal the Younger, who ended up being burned at the stake, was a man who looked to establish a one-on-one personal relationship with the Hebrew God, the God of the Bible, the God of the prophets. Borges was a man who was fascinated by theology and wanted to understand in what way Jews, in their dialogue with their God and in their vision of the ethical and moral code that they devised, from the Ten Commandments to the Talmud and Mishnah and Gemara, are unique, and especially unique in the context of the galut or the golah, two different terms that both connect with the concept of the diaspora. I am going to go ahead and also suggest that Borges is a rabbi or a rabbinical figure. And I know I might be putting myself in a difficult situation. He had no interest in organized religion whatsoever, and he only occasionally wrote about rabbis, although he wrote frequently about the Kabbalah. He wrote frequently about people in Jewish life like Kafka and Spinoza and the Maharal of Prague that created the Golem, that were connected with the rabbinical tradition. And I say that he was a rabbi more less in the way that I'm referring to Luis de Carvajal as a community organizer, brave in that he is pushing his community to acknowledge its secret voice, and more in the connection of what a rabbi does with knowledge, bring in all kinds of sources that are easily and distantly and complexly available, and create an argument, create a narrative based on those sources. So I'm using the word rabbi as a metaphor, as an allegory, but also as an expansive term that enables us to see leaders of communities or of thinking groups that take us all in a step above or beyond. I want to actually devote myself to two rabbis in this last session. One is a very enigmatic figure that goes by the name of Monsieur Chouchani or Chouchani. I'm really going to spend very little time with him, but I felt that it was important. You'll see why. And then I want to really focus on the theology of who might arguably be the most fascinating left-leaning rabbi of Latin America and its entire history, a man who was born in the United States and moved to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and then pushed that community in new and different directions. That is Rabbi Marshall Meyer. First about Chouchani, we, as I mentioned, know very little. I assume that at this point you have seen some of the sources that I have offered in the syllabus. There are a number of, there's one book that was originally published in French about Chouchani. I was talking with one of you, not a very good book, suffering of poor writing and bad editing, but offers insightful and important information. And there are two, maybe three documentaries. I listed one or two of them in the syllabus that give us a larger, more comprehensive picture of Chouchani that might be useful. But even with them, the case of Chouchani is rather emblematic. In order to get to appreciate who he was, I want to say two things. The first one is I want to go back to Borges. Borges has a short story called Funes de Memorios, Funes el Memorioso, about a man in the early part of the 20th century who has a portentous, maybe monstrous memory in that he is able, his name is Irineo Funes, he is able to remember everything. Just everything. Borges gives us a short story that is about the relationship between it's in the third person, but kind of the leading narrative voice. It goes by the name of Borges himself, although it's not the real Borges, because Borges in the 1920s would have been only 20 or 25, whereas in the short story, he's already 40 or 50. And this man, Irineo Funes, that lives in the province, he's the daughter of a woman who washes clothes, doesn't have a big education of any kind, just the contrary, but begins reading Ptolemy's, certain philosophical figures, and can remember every page, every word, every dot, every comma, everything of every page, just completely and fully. And he establishes a series of conversations with Borges, and eventually we learn that one thing that this man cannot do is think, because Borges argues that the capacity to think entails the capacity to forget. If we remember everything, and here let me stress that in Judaism, remembering is central to historical remembering, Talmudic remembering, remembering in terms of knowledge is central to our task, and we are carriers of that memory from one generation to the next. It's part of what the Jewish identity is about. The story by Borges isn't about a Jew, but with all the interest that he had, it is not surprising that he would be writing about the capacity to forget. Not forget by being disinterested on something. But Borges stresses if we were to remember every cloud on the sky every day of our lives, or if we were able to remember every single image that happened in our childhood, then we would simply be overwhelmed by them. And to think is to abstract, to eliminate, to create bridges between different anecdotes. And ultimately, the character of Funes dies because he is not able to live any day as a day unto itself, but he spends an entire day remembering another day. He requires an entire day and thus doesn't live in that second day because he can't forget anything. And I mentioned the word monster because I think it's a cautionary tale that Borges gives us. In the middle of the 20th century, he writes it. The Holocaust is already taking place. The question of what to remember and what to forget is going to be central for us Jews. And also at a time when there's an obsessiveness with remembering information as if that meant that you're a genius, knowing, having information. Whereas what the short story really says is that, or suggests, is that information is not knowledge. Knowledge is the capacity to create bridges between information. And today, in the 21st century, as we conclude the first quarter, everybody has access to information. But knowledge, as AI is coming to the fore, is going to become even more and more difficult. The capacity to think critically, the capacity to individualize information, and the capacity to discern what is authentic and what is untruthful. Well, I think that we can use Funes as a perfect metaphor to understand Chouchani. There is, as I mentioned, very little information about him. Two major 20th century Jewish figures were his students. One of them was Elie Wiesel, who met him in Paris, was absolutely struck by his capacity to remember entire pages of the Talmud, and who became both attracted and repelled because Chouchani seemed to be a man who was a bit of a clochard, a homeless figure that would appear and disappear, that smelled, that had his documents never quite in order. At least that is what we get from Elie Wiesel. And the other one is Emmanuel Levinas, the major phenomenological philosopher who was interested in the other. And also met in Paris, Chouchani, became his student, was equally both attractive and repelled. Apparently, Chouchani had that capacity of being a mentor and a teacher that would be very severe with his students, very emblematic. He would fascinate them, but then he would be a bit of an Eliyahu character, disappear from sight and return. As time has gone by, friends, more information about Chouchani has emerged. I don't have time here to present it all. I made a pilgrimage, and this is what I wanted to put it here. I wrote a book called The Seventh Heaven, Travels Through Jewish Latin America. I spent 5 years traveling from one community to another, trying to understand if there is truly a Jewish Latin American identity, or if instead it's really Argentine Jews and Peruvian Jews and Mexican Jews, and went to communities of indigenous people that think of themselves as the 13th or the 10th tribe, depending, and went to the families of the desaparecidos during the Dirty War, embedded myself in neo-Nazi marches and talked to ultra-right figures in Chile, in Argentina, in Bolivia, talked to conversos and descendants of conversos. And in a variety of moments, people would point me in the direction of a cemetery in Montevideo, where Chouchani, this emblematic man, had been buried. And I went to his tomb and wanted to put a pebble, as is the tradition in Jewish life. And in doing so, met a kind of Hasid hippie that was dancing around the tombstone of Chouchani. And we engaged in a series of conversations on why we were there, each of us for different reasons. And it is him who really gave me a kind of broader picture of Chouchani, and also who told me about the concept of the seventh heaven in Judaism, the various spheres, the ascendance of the soul in the Neoplatonic way, and how he believed that Chouchani had achieved the highest status, a very folkloric kind of personal viewpoint. I did feel, friends, that there was a particular aura or magnetism in that tomb, and that it was the center of my trip of those 5 years. I had not known much about Chouchani, and that propelled me forward. Why did Chouchani, at the end of his life, 7, 8 years before he died, choose to go to Montevideo, of all places, live there with the Jewish community, and ultimately die there? He's having no money whatsoever. It was Elie Wiesel, who ended up paying for the tombstone and kept it clean and going for a long time. All this is part of a larger secret or a larger quest. Today, a number of people who either met Chouchani or were children when he was very little, and Chouchani stayed in their homes in Buenos Aires, in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, in Paris, and even in Turkey, have come out and told us stories of the type of man that he was and how abrasive or how asocial he was, but also how magical and mystical. So there is more information in a series of notebooks that he left have been digitized and are on display at the Central Library, the National Library in Israel. And I pointed you in that direction. Chouchani, and I've spent a good amount of time with some Chouchani scholars, to me seems to be a kind of Funes character. He has a lot of knowledge about the Talmud, the Gemara, the Kabbalah, but you have to infer from his writing that is non-sequential, that is chaotic, that seems to be little notes that he's keeping to himself, that throws them into suitcases, doesn't cohere and doesn't become a larger argument. I was in another class that I taught at the 92nd Street Y, almost exclusively on Chouchani. I was reflecting on what lasts and what dies intellectually. And for better or worse, what lasts has some kind of argument, has a voice that will speak to the next generation. What becomes emblematic is maybe notes or scattered and dribbling reflections, but here we have to dig or explore and come up with interpretations of ourselves. And so I don't know if Chouchani had the capacity to think fully. I know that he had the capacity to remember, and that maybe that capacity, both Wiesel and Levinas talk about it, is monstrous. When I was a very young man, I wanted to remember everything. As I get older, at 65, I am ready and eager to give away things, knowledge, and other such things. I don't want to accumulate. I want to pass on to others. So Chouchani is very interesting. Is he a rabbi? Again, I use the term rabbi here as a torch that passes on knowledge, even when the knowledge doesn't reach students in a coherent and sequential way. And I now pass, friends, to my last character in this exploration of Latin American Jewish theology, Rabbi Marshall Meyer. Rabbi Marshall Meyer was an American born in Connecticut, Norwich, Connecticut, who came from a secular family. And in his early 20s, he went to Dartmouth, and in his early 20s met Rabbi Abraham Yeshua Heschel, who, by the way, turns his death is exactly 50 years ago this year. Heschel was a major, as you all know, friends, American Jewish theologian who had been born in Europe and was one of the only survivors in his family. Many of the other ones perished during the Shoah. Eventually found his footing as a rabbi and taught for many years at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the Upper West Side. This a man with white hair and a long beard, somewhat looking like a Don Quixote figure, who was interested, if Levinas was interested in humanizing the other. What I think Heschel was interested, among other things, is in in human search for God, equal to God's search for man. God is constantly looking for humans to establish a dialogue, just as humans always have to be looking for God. And he talks about Shabbat, he talks about the prophets, he talks about a liturgy as possibilities of encounters with the divine. The conservative movement, and here I use conservative in the religious Jewish term, was sometimes aggressive throughout Heschel, though he taught for many years. At JTS, he was always kept on the margins. He was not given an assistant. There's a whole argument there of how they felt that his fame and reputation was either not fully deservable or that was eclipsing that of others. But Heschel became a very popular theological figure in the 1960s and 70s. His daughter now herself teaches at Dartmouth, Susanna Heschel, a good friend. When Marshall Meyer met him, he was struck by his humility and his capacity to organize and talk to people about very complex ideas. And it was him that prompted Rabbi Marshall Meyer to enter rabbinical school and eventually even become an assistant of Abraham Yeshua Heschel. Rabbi Marshall Meyer, after getting a couple of gigs in the United States, went to Argentina, moved to Argentina, and it is that portion of Marshall Meyer's career that is most interesting to me. And I should prepare you also in regards to the fact that there are some elements that are difficult to digest of Rabbi Marshall Meyer, that are problematic and continue to project themselves, continue to project a less than a positive light on him. Having come from JTS, from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Meyer went to Argentina and found the following: found the largest Jewish community in the Americas, in the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese Americas, but absolutely disorganized, unaffiliated to synagogues, and where rabbis mostly simply performed rituals without necessarily offering a theological view of things. He was a foreigner in Buenos Aires. We're talking about an American who didn't have a full grasp of the Spanish language, that taught himself that language, and that eventually became a central figure of the Argentine Jewish community. This took many years, and he arrived at a moment where in Latin America in general, and particularly in Argentina, the Teología de la Liberación, theology of liberation, was central and was flabbergasted by this movement in the tension with the Pope and with the Catholic Church. Essentially, what the Teología de la Liberación, the theology of liberation, proposes is that the priest is a descendant of the biblical prophets and needs to communicate with the most fragile aspects of society, the poor, the downtrodden, the ones that don't have access to power. And the true mission of Catholicism and of those priests is to organize and defend those that cannot defend themselves, of the higher powers, that is, including the church itself, but also the government and the wealth and even foreign intervention. This is not the place for me to go beyond the theology of liberation, but one thing it's important here to think, and that is, how do you adapt the theology of liberation to Judaism? That is what it was in Rabbi Marshall Meyer's mind. How do you create a Jewish community at a time of immense poverty, immense inequality in Latin America, where people don't feel connected to the shul, to the synagogue, and yet there's a desperate need for a leadership in those institutions that not only opens its doors to the Jewish community, but opens its doors to the poor and to the downtrodden that are not Jewish, also, that are not Jewish themselves. As you might imagine, he became incredibly controversial. There were segments of the Jewish community who were fascinated in embracing him. And there were segments of the Jewish community in Argentina who thought, who is this outsider, an American who doesn't really understand what we are all about and who is pushing our community? We came from poverty. We are immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe. We have already entered the middle class. Why go back to that past? Why connect to a population that has nothing to do with us? And Marshall Meyer remained stern and convinced and forward-looking in his approach. He created two major institutions in Argentina. One is the very important conservative Jewish synagogue called Bet El, that at the beginning only had 3 families when he started, and then by the time he left Argentina, had hundreds of families, was the biggest, the most dynamic of all the synagogues. At a time when synagogues, many Latin American Jews were unaffiliated and didn't see themselves connected with the shul to understand their identity. And in that piece that I gave you, he explains how the state of Israel and Zionism are and were much more important to the shaping of the Latin American Jewish identity than the synagogue as a place. And the other big institution, and it's a place that I've been to many times, and it's just fascinating in its contradictions, it's the Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano, the Latin American Rabbinical Seminary in Buenos Aires. It's the place that ordains most of the rabbis that go into the various communities all over Latin America and in the United States. Some very important Jewish congregations, Jewish synagogues, including Bnei Jeshurun, where Rabbi Meyer, upon his return of Argentina, led services where he died in his early 60s is now led by younger Argentine rabbis that were ordained and trained at the Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano. I'm in the book, The Seventh Heaven, I reflect on the fact that whereas in the United States, there are all kinds of yeshivot, yeshivas, where people can study Talmud and Gemara, and there are a substantial number of rabbinical schools, depending of the movement, Orthodox, meaning Mother Orthodox, or conservative, or Reform, or Reconstructionist, where rabbis get ordained from and then go to lead. Latin America has very, very, very few rabbinical schools. There are some yeshivas, including in Buenos Aires and in my native Mexico, but they are small. And there is another rabbinical school, much smaller in size, in the Reform movement in Argentina. But by far the largest is the Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano, outsized in its influence and in its kind of tentacles all over Latin America. When I was in Cuba, the rabbi would come from Chile to perform the high holidays, and that Chilean rabbi had been trained at the Seminario Rabínico. When I was in Peru, the rabbi in Lima, just to walk 3 or 4 blocks, needed an entourage of security because of the anti-Semitism and the daily violence. And he himself and some of the security members had been trained at the Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano. So what kind of theology did Rabbi Marshall Meyer have? In the piece that I gave you about the Jewish theology in Latin America, fascinating lecture that he delivered in the United States, he says that there are a lot of misconceptions about what Latin America in general are all about, and Latin American Jews, in that those misconceptions are often generated by the higher echelons of power. He's writing during the Central American wars of the Contras, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and he says he accuses the American Jewish community of misinforming its people about the Nicaraguan community, who leads it, and the kind of connections that it might or might not have to the environment in general and to the government. And he says that the biggest task of Latin American Jewry in terms of theology is to connect with the theology of liberation, that the rabbi needs to become, he says, the true first founders of La Teología de la Liberación, the theology of liberation, are the biblical prophets, Isaiah and Amos and others, and that in that they sympathized with the oppressed and connected with them in a way to create a triangle between God, the prophet, and the people. And that the task of the rabbi in Latin America, in his view, needs to be something similar. That though not prophets, the rabbi shares with the prophet the capacity to speak to those that don't have access to power and that are desperate in need of the fragility that they have in their own life. I don't need to go far deeper in this, but as you know, Latin America is a continent of huge economic and educational contrasts. where illiteracy is still very high. And my God, I'm talking today on January, 13, and God, what is coming from Washington to about Venezuela and Cuba and Colombia and Mexico is nothing short of frightening. This appears to be America's backyard where you can replace a government and you can send bombs, and it's really the oil and the wealth that Americans want, ignoring the vastness, the complexity, the richness of the environment. I am absolutely struck by the fact that that speech of Marshall Meyer in the 1980s has the resonances that it does in the context of what we are going through today. That is absolutely frightening. The story doesn't end up well, friends. The story of Marshall Meyer is, well, it has a height that is absolutely emblematic. During the Dirty War, he becomes a major figure in negotiating the finding out the whereabouts of the Jewish desaparecidos and the Jews that had been imprisoned by the military junta because of their left-wing persuasions. There are a number of speeches he gives of the times that he has to go to different prisons and talk to soldiers and guards and generals and lieutenants who tell him time and again that they are finishing the job that the Nazis started. I mentioned this, I think last session or the session before that. They see the military junta sees itself as a descendant of the SS, and it is not surprising. Again, I mentioned this in the last session that in terms of numbers, Jewish victims during the Dirty War were much more higher than any other religious or ethnic group. As if it's not because they were Jewish that they were trapped, but the fact that they were Jewish was a good invitation to kidnap them and to torture them and eventually to kill them. There are today, if you go to Argentina, and Argentina has done a great effort in remembering. Talk about that. It's connected with Chouchani and with Funes. And there is a guide that you can acquire where you go, and in each street, it will tell you where an individual was kidnapped, at what time, who was the member of the members of the army. There are little red dots or yellow dots on the floor that lead you to the next site, and it's a project called El Proyecto de la Memoria, the Project of Memory. I was involved with it and also involved in the translation into English of this extraordinary document. It invites you to navigate Buenos Aires as a contemporary city, but as a city that wants to remember the ghosts that lived in it and then were erased by the junta. And there is one particular case, I also mentioned it last time, the case of a very prominent journalist, Jacobo Timerman, who was the editor-in-chief of La Opinión, a left-leaning newspaper, who was imprisoned, and Marshall Meyer, with the help of the Israeli government and parts of the Jewish community, negotiated the freedom of Jacobo Timerman. And Timerman eventually wrote a book about it. We're going to be reading it in that book club, that Magna, was mentioning, the book is called Prisioneros sin nombre, celda sin número, Prisoner Without a Name, a Cell Without a Number, where he chronicles his ordeal from the kidnapping through the torture that he went through and ultimate liberation. And the book is dedicated to Marshall Meyer, and then describes in great detail what Rabbi Meyer did for him. That's the highlight. Maybe the low light, if I could use that term, is that the Jewish community in Argentina was divided at its heart by the role of Marshall Meyer. On the one hand, the left-leaning one, mostly young people, thought he was a hero, maybe a contemporary biblical prophet, and that they saw him as their leader and representative. And he was beloved by young people, but the majority of victims were young. And then there were the older people, sometimes simply the parents of the other ones, of the younger people, who felt that he was leading the Jewish community astray, that he was the pinky rabbi, el rabino comunista, el rabino rojo, and were looking desperately to find a way to get rid of him. And the story of getting rid of him is rather complicated. While being celebrated, there was a series of rumors that began to circulate in the Jewish community that he was a pedophile. If it sounds like America today, there are echoes, no doubt about it, and that he took advantage of little Jewish boys, particularly in Camp Ramah, which is the third important organization that he had built. Those two sides really fought with each other. He became a very divisive figure, and ultimately he and his wife, Naomi, left the country and moved back to the United States, where after a couple of stints, he became the rabbi of Jeshurun on the Upper West Side, and where I met him, and he had some conversations with him. Unfortunately, even at Bnei Jeshurun, quite recently, there were also rumors about him and his pedophilia side, and a series of, I forget exactly if they're fellowships or some kind of other named activity that the synagogue had the name of Marshall Meyer has been taken out, and now they are called by something else. And the internal investigation was led by the two rabbis, including Rabbi Rolly Matalon, who were students of Rabbi Marshall Meyer. So let me wrap things up here, friends, by asking the question about the ethical Jew today in a context like Latin America. For a leader of a congregation in a landscape that is defined by inequality and by abuse of power and corruption, also by the vision of a foreign force, the United States, that sees itself as having the right to come in and take over at any point. What is the role that the leader of the congregation should have? I ask myself this when I think of him, and I ask myself this also when I ponder the role of the rabbi, particularly from the Enlightenment to the present. We have the role of the rabbi has mutated over time, and we have in Hasidism, a rabbi that can encourage the people to dance, and it's a storyteller and is the keeper of the memory of the people, or the rabbi that can be a kind of priestly figure that is involved with bar and banot mitzvot, and that does homilies and all kinds of other administrative jobs? Or should the rabbi become a political figure, the way some priests in Latin America have chosen to become? Last thought here, and we can go in the Q&A if we feel like it. Rabbi Marshall Meyer, in the piece that I gave you, says that Latin American, there are many things of that piece that don't fully square to me, and that might be biased in the way they are presented. There's one interesting moment where he says that Latin American Jews are very Zionist, and that the state of Israel is actually a far more potent source of identity and identity shaping than the synagogue. It's true. Though there are conservative, Orthodox, the fastest growing in Latin America today side is the Orthodox, in particularly Hasidim, Lubavitchers, Chabad, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform. Affiliation to synagogues, though it has increased, is not what it is in other parts of the world. Anti-Semitism is high. It's particularly anti-Semitism that comes from the left-wing governments. And the question here is, what role do rabbis take in leading those communities? Vis-a-vis Israel, especially after October 7, and vis-a-vis aspects of non-Jewish life that connect with the theology of liberation. One way or another, the chapter of Rabbi Marshall Meyer remains very vivid in people's imaginations. It is for some a lesson of courage and of honesty and ethical commitment to the immediate present. And for others, it's a perversion of what Jewish leadership might be, and dangerous, and it embraces far too quickly and uncritically views of Marxism and communism and socialism, etc. Thinking that the Seminario Rabínico is the biggest school that sends rabbis all over, this is an important topic. And thinking also that there are not many other alternatives for people to define themselves as rabbis or define themselves as leaders. So with this, friends, I come to the end. It has been a real joy. I want once again thank Magda and the wonderful people of Jewish Studies at Fordham and at New York Public Library, eager to hear some of your thoughts about all this. I propose all this simply as a beginning of larger explorations about what it means to be a Jewish leader connected with theology in Latin America, and the fact that he was an American that had come to Latin America, but also connected with one of the most impressive of theologians in the United States, Heschel. I think it's quite significant. Gracias, Magda. Back to you. And I know that there are a number of comments. I haven't quite followed them, but I could do it myself, or I could follow you.
Thank you so much for this. I'm just bringing myself back to
take
you.
Your time.
So I invite now questions or comments. There were like mostly comments in about the impact of the Seminario Rabínico across America and in Latin America in particular. I want to start perhaps by asking you about Marshall Meyer and that theology of exploring power and powerlessness, and whether now, knowing what we know about his personal life, how do we read this, the work, his essays, his theology in light of his own abuses?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Magda, it's that eternal question of the artist who can produce a superb work of art, but who themselves can be rather complex and amoral figures, and we have them in a number of different moments in history. Of course, this becomes even more complicated when it's a religious figure that, on the one hand, is pushing a particular community, and in this case is the most prominent, largest Jewish community in Latin America, in one direction that is fitting to the moment of the theology of liberation, and then it comes with the baggage of some allegations that come from that community in order to get rid of him, and some others that might be true as they relate to his own background. So it's not easy. I don't purport to have an answer. I find him emblematic, enigmatic, path opening, but also paralyzing in his approach. I tend to be skeptical of saints. Saints, I don't believe in a perfect life. I believe in always an improved life. And as a teacher and as a writer, that is my quest. And one teaches not by our words, but one teaches by modeling oneself as an individual. And I see the contradictions in Marshall Meyer. I find him to be almost a literary character for a novel, that his wife has kept some of the information, has not allowed people to reprint several important lectures and documents. There's a book, there's a compilation of them, but there was an attempt to write a biography that was stymied because of these controversial elements. So it's challenging. It's very challenging. And finally, more challenging in a landscape where there aren't many. I mean, if we had 30 Marshall Meyers in Latin America, it would be easier, but we only have one or two. So that's more complicated.
Yeah, and there was a question earlier, a comment that about the fact that it's very interesting that he was an American.
Yeah.
And so in some way in your presentation, but last time and this time, you're kind of bringing people sort of from the outside,
Right.
Whether it's Borges or whether it's the American rabbi coming into Latin America in that way. I wonder whether you could maybe comment a little bit about that sort of
course.
outsidedness of those people that we're studying as examples
I'm
of
fascinated, Magda, and whoever posed this question. I'm fascinated by the role of the outsider. The outsider has the capacity to see things that insiders don't, but also to be a kind of ghostly figure that, by virtue of the location where that person it finds themselves, ultimately can generate all kinds of resentment and discomfort and suspicion. As an immigrant to the United States, I have that element of being an outsider. As a Jew that grew up in Mexico, I always felt as an outsider in the country, always very grateful, but never feeling I could be fully part of it. And my interest in the indigenous parts, histories of Mexico, my interest in aspects of other aspects of Mexican history have been defined by the fact that I did not belong to the groups that are all insiders, the schools that shape them. I think that there's great advantages in that outsiderness. I remember, though, not too long ago, having a manuscript of mine evaluated. And the manuscript was about being an outsider. And the anonymous evaluator, very rightly so, said, look, Professor Stavans has been in this country for 35 years. He's a leading figure of all these topics. Is he really an outsider? Is this just a performative approach that he's taking? At what point do you stop being an outsider and become an insider? That is also a topic that fascinates
Intentional, the first speech of Rabbi Meyer that we read sounds so current. So
me.
I
Yeah.
don't know whether that's the same book.
Excellent two questions. The answer to the first question is I edited a volume of primary texts in the late 90s called about, it might have been my very first attempt at putting together in one single volume the primary text of the memoir of Luis de Carvajal and stories by Borges and other such material. And it includes this piece called Thoughts on Latin America. The book is titled The Cross and the Scroll, A Thousand Years of Jewish Hispanic Life, because it goes back in Spain before the expulsion in 1492. It was published by Routledge. And I was, Doris Lessing once said that if you're going to do something, always do it right away and do it in the present, because the circumstances are going to change and then nothing is going to, you're not going to have the same possibilities. And it was at a time when these allegations against Marshall Meyer circulated, but had not become as stern. And I managed to get permission from his wife to reprint this in that anthology. I don't know if I would get permission from his estate or his hair. So it's in the book, and it's a good piece. I also send it to you, so it should be in the material for the course.
Well, I know you're under the weather today, so I especially am grateful for you doing this, and I'm grateful to all of you for being with us. I hope you'll continue joining us at our events on Zoom and online, except for the whether site-specific like exhibits or the book, our traditional intimate conversations like the reading groups. All of the events are accessible online. So those of you who are far away in Latin America or Canada or wherever, we hope to see you online. And those of you who are in New York, in person. So thank you. Muchas gracias, Ilan.
Gracias a ti, a todos.
And we'll see you around on Zoom or online. Thank you so much for all joining us. And we'll